Love Log 1, the 5th of January 2023. These are a series of reflections which will be used, hopefully, in a book on love in the East and the West, which I'm contemplating with Li Shuo. In these short talks, I will gather together thoughts which may go into the book and are a chance to reflect back on my encounter with the topic of love and marriage. The first thing to note is that the education in love, and that might indeed be the title of a chapter, is very well documented indeed in my autobiography. I imagine that since love is so important in Anglo-Saxon culture, there are many other autobiographical accounts of people's love lives, both based on memory and maybe some documents, and also obviously hugely in fictional literature. Love and its ups and downs, as well as marriage, are the central theme of English literature after all. 80%, I imagine, of novels and poetry and other forms are concerned with love and marriage. But as far as I know, the day-to-day documentation of a person growing up within such a culture has not been made, because very few people keep the materials. Also, very few people have had the experience of really fulfilling loving relationships, firstly with parents and then with a series of girlfriends and then a long and loving marriage. So thinking about, for example, my book on Oxford undergraduate, apart from the work and friendship and some other activities, the central theme is the education in love, the love letters between myself and my two girlfriends of that time, and falling in love. And that only continues what is already quite widely or deeply described in previous books, particularly in Lakeland Life and in the Sedberg book. What I realize is that both from my experience and through my teaching, for example, in encountering love in great English literature, particularly Shakespeare, I was being educated for the experience of love from a very early age, and it was a central theme of my education. The reason for that I'll explore elsewhere, which is that unusually in human cultures, the English diverted the strong affection and love that a child has for their parents in another direction by sending them away, or psychologically sending them away, so that no longer were they fixated on their parental generation, but they went out into the market of love to find a suitable partner. And this was something that would determine much of their fate, the success or failure in that search. And therefore, like Sir Galahad or the Knights of the Round Table, you were on a quest for love, and your childhood was a training, as the Knights of the Round Table were trained to fight and overcome difficulties. So you were trained to find a suitable partner and then to nourish that love. So I think by going through my autobiographical books, I would actually be able to create a rather interesting theme of love and marriage and what it had been in my life, extracting relevant materials, both the descriptions of that process but also the wider context within which I learnt to separate and then rejoin with a chosen person. So that is a new theme which I hadn't thought about, but I think would be of interest in China and maybe in the West as well, because it is, as far as I know, unique. The second theme, which I will explore somewhat, concerns something else that I had not really thought about for some time, and that is that as part of my education in love, I studied it academically. As far as I know, the first real formal attempt to study love and marriage and sexual behaviour occurred after I'd finished my DPhil at Oxford, when I went to the London School of Economics, and there I did a master's dissertation on related themes, that is, prohibition of certain marital relations and the aspects of love, and at the same time studied the diary of Ralph Jocelyn, 17th century clergyman, who gives us some very revealing hints about love and his relations with his wife and his children's affairs and so on. So from that period I was writing about and thinking about love, and certainly when I went to Nepal, among other things, I observed the shock of going to a still largely arranged marriage society. I'd read about it in my anthropological training, but actually living in a society where marriage is arranged usually was brought it home to me. When I came back, I wondered what to do next, and when it was suggested that I apply for a research fellowship at King's College in Cambridge, they wanted an outline of what I was going to do during that history research fellowship. And I remembered that I had been assembling a good deal of material, only part of which I'd used in my MPhil. And so I proposed that I would study love and marriage in England in the early modern period, that is, from about 1450 to 1750. And so for the nearly 4 years of my senior research fellowship, that was the official topic that I was studying. Because I was doing many other things like finishing and turning my PhD into a book on Nepal, editing Jocelyn's diary, which gave me further material, starting the study of English villages in depth, particularly Earl's Coen, I was not full-time working on the subject, but I was gathering things, and I was lecturing in the history faculty on the history of marriage and kinship, and assembling more and more materials, diaries, letters, contemporary materials on the subject and theme of love and marriage. But somehow I couldn't pull it together at that time into a book or even series of articles. And when I became a lecturer in anthropology in 1975, I was diverted in many other directions and extremely busy learning to teach and administer and so on within anthropology. And I would need to check, but I don't think I got back to the subject very explicitly until about 5 years later. It's true that I was lecturing on population studies, which the Malthusian marriage system is very much tied up with the romantic love complex and late age of marriage and the choice of marriage, and depends on it. So it was there implicitly, but not too explicitly. And so it was really only, I think, in about 1981-82 that I started again to try to see how I could turn all the material I'd already assembled into a book. Again, I was diverted. We started various other projects, including soon the Naga project, and I wrote about other things on violence and methodology, historical methodology. So again, I was tinkering with it, and the files increased, and a way of bringing it all together seemed more and more elusive. I imagine it was about 1984-85, to be checked, that I got back to the subject and scribbled, and just had these hundreds and thousands of quotations and ideas and readings and so on, and wrote them all out at length, far too long and far too complicated, and tried to find a theme, which was again the Malthusian marriage system. Sarah did a wonderful work in typing all my illegible ramblings out and shortening them and making them more orderly. And by the end of 85, I suppose, or earlier, I had produced 150,000 or less words on the theme of marriage and love in England as a book, which I submitted to Blackwell's, which John Davey took. It was not totally unrelated to the work on the origins of English individualism, which I'd done in 1977, because that had, in a sense, by pushing the English family system and capitalism back into the early Middle Ages and stressing the importance of this peculiar pattern of separating off the generations and sending children away from home. That had given me a new theoretical framework different from that of the conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom was that love was something that was invented as part of the rise of capitalism from the early 16th century, and therefore it wasn't really present that most people in medieval England, as elsewhere, had arranged marriages, and romantic love was just something you found in some literature. And that was the view of Lawrence Stone and others in their books. But having redated the capitalist revolution and the strangeness of the English family system, I was able to look at this whole thing in a new light and a new framework. So the book was written in and published in 1986, and some of the argument was used in a lecture I gave in University of Virginia in 1986-87 on love, and that was expanded into an essay on love and capitalism, which was published in my Culture of Capitalism book of that year. That, interestingly, was more or less where I stopped on the subject. So, picking it up now in 2023 is something like 46 years later. Of course, I've thought about it, and as I mentioned, I've wrote about it a lot in my autobiography, but I haven't kept up to date with the literature, and I haven't really expanded it outwards, because what suddenly is exciting is the fact that my work on that subject in my book was quite insular. I obviously took into account anthropological and other summaries of what love was in many types of social structure and civilization, but I hadn't made any sort of study of it, except to a certain extent among the Gurungs. But they had a fairly small society and a simple arranged marriage system on the whole. It was only in 1990 that we went to Japan, and interestingly, that raised the whole question again, because I was explicitly invited by the Nakamuras to lecture and to study love and marriage, because Toshiko had read my book on marriage and love in England. It was a subject of great interest, particularly to Japanese women, how to understand Western love in relation to their own marriage system. So particularly on that first visit in 1990, and then subsequently I talked to a lot of people, and we had little seminars about love and marriage and what were the causes. And here I got a new perspective, for example, from Kenichi, about the importance of religion and Christianity, the importance of individualism, and other features. And Japan was particularly fascinating because in terms of its social structure it was very like England. Its family system had curious resemblances to the English family system. Its class system, as well as its political system, legal system, was eerily familiar, and yet its culture was totally different and was clearly behind a real difference. Japan, as I now realize, was not just at the other end of a continuum, or in the middle between arranged marriage and love marriage. It was, as with many things Japanese, off that scale. It was unique and different, and you couldn't measure it against Western sociological theories of love, as I'd read about them. So Japan, about which I developed a few sections in my book on Japan, but I didn't explore this very thoroughly, and that would benefit from being more widely explored. But that was the beginning, because in 1996 we went to China, and then from 2002 onwards I've been studying Chinese history and culture quite extensively. And China, again, is a really fascinating example of something which is neither Western nor arranged. And there is a huge amount to be learnt about Chinese love and marriage. It's a particularly interesting subject in both Japan and China, because it takes you right down into the deeper psychological contradictions and changes that are occurring as those two civilizations encounter the Western love and marriage and individualistic patterns. It was the theme of W.J. Good's work, which I highly respected and read about, which was about world family patterns and how they spread and included love. And his general thesis, as I recall it, was that, as with other features of the West, of capitalism and individualism and so on, Western individualistic love marriage, which had been treated as highly selfish and ridiculous by most people in the East for a long time, it was part of a package which would be spread along with democracy and the rule of law and all the rest of it from America. Now, we no longer think of that as inevitable or a package, and so the situation now in China and Japan is intriguing as revealing a situation like two great rivers of different colours meeting and flowing down together, but not entirely mixing. And you don't have a hybrid, you have a curious interweaving of different themes. So this projected volume, which must be short, it mustn't get bogged down in too many quotations and too much empirical data, and yet enough of that to make it lively. So I envisage a book with Li Shuo of 100,000 words at the most, preferably a little shorter, which stands up, as my books have tried to do recently, above the situation on a mountain and looks down on some of the great themes of love and marriage across cultures, comparing the Anglosphere, the continental, the Japanese, the Chinese, and to an extent the tribal situations described by anthropologists, and sees what are the patterns and how they are changing and where they are going. Because love and marriage are not only changing hugely in the East, but also in the West, and therefore observing one's own grandchildren and students and friends, you can see big changes here as well. So it is a work in progress, because everything is in flux because of well-known wider things like social media and so on. But a cross-section and a historical account of how we got to where we are may be of wider interest, and certainly will knit together a whole theme, rather like my book, my political education. This is my love education, if you like. It's how I learnt about the subject, what I've learnt about the subject, and indeed my political education is quite a good model, because there I've started autobiographically and then included later works that I've done on the subject as a preparation for working on democracy, East and West. So this is my love education, and a subject which I've attempted and thought about a good deal over my life, on and off, and now is the chance to bring it all together with the help of my young Chinese friends, and particularly Li Shuo.